Hey guys, welcome back. In this sort of final video where we wrap up our pipeline and really just finish up everything and just import it in Unreal. I've also fixed my desktop, which is always great news. So first, let's start with Substance Designer. Now, I've finished up with the I just tweaked it a little bit more, added a couple of more attributes. In other words, I exposed some parameters. And if we take a look here at my sand, I also blended a couple of color gradients together in order to create a more believable sort of version of what sand might look like. Now, this is obviously not the best. I've also exposed my normal map intensity just so that we can change it in real time in Unreal. Generally speaking, there's always things to be done. You can always add or remove stuff to get it as much as you like to, close as much as you like. However, I'm not going to do that. Now you'll notice that all of our outputs are 16-bit, and really you shouldn't be having that, especially on grayscales like these. So you should change the format on, for example, here this blend here to be not inheriting from input on the output format, not from input, but it has to be relative to either parent or absolute in order to actually force it to be 8-bit. And obviously it will propagate further down the sort of the chain here. Now, that being said, we only have one substance, so I'm really not going to bother with that. It's not optimized, but what the hell. Clearly, by the way, this is not only the smallest possible, but there's obviously much bigger graphs we can make. So whatever it is you're doing, make sure it's not as super slow. Okay, don't go super slow. Right, so what we're going to do now is simply publish our substance here. So I'm simply going to publish this selected element as an SBSAR file, which is only readable by external applications. In other words, you cannot actually edit this. This is not a project file. And actually, let's just go ahead and say publish file here. As you can see, same options available. I'm going to save this. It's going to give me some options. For example, I could expose my pixel size. My output size is exposed by default, and of course the random seed is also exposed. You want to be able to change that in real time, or well, not in runtime, but in real time. Although you might definitely change it in runtime as well. Okay. That being said, compression mode should be left to auto. Obviously, this is basically for your for your maps here, the outputs. But I'm going to click OK, and that is basically designer done. Next, we need to go ahead and take a look at some of our definitions here when it comes to to the workspace itself. So as you can see, we have a .painter log file, which I don't think has to be versioned. In other words, you don't want to be checking it out every single time. So I've kind of removed it from the overall setup here. As you can see, we've got a painter lock here with a wildcard past the SP folder, which I don't know if it's needed or not to be versioned, but in my opinion it isn't, so it's up to you, obviously. Then I moved my ASBin file, which is essentially a baking data compressed, allowing you for faster iteration on your bakes. I don't need those either, since these are local and can be generated at any time, so those don't have to be versioned themselves, especially since you'll be overwriting them quite a lot. So I kind of removed them as well. By the way, this used to be like this, import, right? And over here. Now, if you're using a P4 ignore file, which would be a text file, I'm not sure if you might have to add a wildcard here. Okay, like this wildcard would represent your hierarchy wildcard, and then the other one would represent your file name wildcard. I'm not entirely sure if that is still the case, but this generally speaking, in this case, this ignores everything in this folder, including the hierarchy itself. Obviously, if you need accepts, like you can add the not operator, and you can accept stuff. For example, everything but, I don't know, a text file or something. Anyway, that being said, I'm not really going to play and tinker with this since it's kind of set up. I just wanted to expose this to you guys. Second of all, you may notice that we got some new folders here, the developers folders. I really don't know where that came from. I believe that's from Painter. But that being said, we're kind of done with our P4V setup for now. Now let's go ahead and open not Painter, but our actual file folder. Sorry, project. So let's go ahead and check this thing out. Actually, wait, where's my... For some reason, I'm pretty sure this actually got disabled. Yeah, for some reason, this is always disabling itself, and it's super annoying. So just give me a second until this thing restarts. Obviously, you have to make sure that your plugin is running if you want to be sending stuff over to Painter. Therefore, you're going to have to actually check this if it's available. So the first thing you do, obviously, if you don't have the Send to Painter button, is obviously run Painter. Otherwise, nothing's gonna happen. And then you have to check if your plugin is enabled. Now let's go ahead and send this guy to Painter. There's our object. You will notice immediately in our log that it says material fung1 is not correctly linked with Unreal Engine 4. That is mainly due to the fact that I simply removed it last time when I was playing around with Painter, since I didn't know how LiveLink would work, and I just wanted to see if it would crash or anything. Now in this case, we actually do need a material definition, because if I start painting something here, you will notice that it will tell me, well, there's nothing we can do. There's no textures we can target with our export. Sorry, there's no material to target with the textures that we get. So we need sort of a material to to get this thing to work. Therefore, I'm going to open this guy, and as you can see, we have a material array here. Excuse me. Now, this material array can use any material really, but what we need is a custom material. So I'm going to make one from scratch. I'm going to call this m_worm, since it is a material for our worm, and I'm simply going to search for it, worm here, and as you can see, it's right there. I'm going to press the down key, the down arrow, and it will actually add it on its own. I'm going to have to check this guy out because obviously it's been versioned. So I'm going to check out the selected, which is essentially our worm here, which also happens to have a material compiled on top of it. If we take a look at the material, you will notice that it's also empty. So there's really no shading information whatsoever here. Speaking of materials, you can also probably have recognized quite a lot of similarities between Designer and Material Editor in Unreal Engine 4. Even these blends here, even though they're separate functions, obviously they're compressed, sort of, contained in a box, which is only one node in Designer and a bunch of properties here. I gotta say, I much prefer Designer over this. But the palette itself's got loads of different stuff, loads of different objects, different transforms, whatever. You can animate shaders. You can do a lot of stuff, and you got a lot of math here as well, truncate, whatever. So definitely, stroll through this, but this is not a priority, so don't go too deep into that. We could talk about this later, but like I said, I don't use it myself much either. I mostly just use the Designer whenever I need it. But some simple procedures, for example, exposing parameters for the engine itself, because much like Designer, you can expose parameters in the Material Editor for use in runtime. There's definitely an appeal to it. Okay. Anyway, point is, I'm just going to keep this open so that we see what we're doing. Now, currently, I have it set up, and if I go ahead and start painting again, it's still going to give me the same problem. Mainly due to the fact that I simply have not linked it properly. So I'm going to close this guy. At least that's the fastest way I know. Maybe there's a better way. And I'm simply going to send this guy to Painter again. Now, one more thing I forgot to mention last time is that if this has collision on it, I don't know, by the time you're seeing this, you're looking at this, probably it's fixed. But as of now, if you have collision on this, it will return an error. So it's gonna throw you a problem, and it's not gonna simply import it, which means that you have to actually export this guy first and then send it to Painter without the collision data. Either that or simply delete the collision. So I'm going to send this thing to Painter, and there we go. As you can see, Painter immediately hooked up with the material and created a bunch of these textures. So let's take a look at at the textures themselves. I'll just reopen this guy. Actually, there must be, oh, there we go, live update. I forgot to click that. Anyway, point is that we've got our textures here. Notice that the metallic roughness and actual ambient occlusion are grayscale sort of maps. However, they're being mapped to each of these channels. That is because it's a very clever way to pack together information, right? If you reckon that we used this before, I think I showed you this before, but you should have a pretty clear understanding of how the channels work. But I'm just going to redo this one more time. As you can see, we've got 3 channels, right? And if we take a look at only one of them, they're all grayscales. That's because they have luminance value of 0 to 255, 256 values altogether, 8-bit channel, 8-bit image. Therefore, you can pack these together in one image, and for example, this red one would be your, I don't know, ambient occlusion. This would be your metallic. This would be your roughness, or vice versa. Whichever way it's being packed, it doesn't matter. The point is that the final result is that you have one texture, one file, and you've got 3 textures in it. So that's kind of like an archive. It's a really good technique. Well, not technique. It's just a method of passing on information. But it's a great method of simply keeping things nice and neat and organized. Now, as you can see here in the log, by the way, whenever you have a problem, always check the logs first. They're great for information. Now, excuse me, as you can see here, we've got our input map errors being thrown. That is because we actually don't have these channels enabled in our texture set. That's obviously something you can easily fix simply by enabling them. Obviously, they also shouldn't be enabled if you don't intend to use them, because they bloat your overall game size and your overall memory sort of piling up. You use a lot of memory if you just have a bunch of useless maps that you never actually utilize. Anyway, as you can see here, each channel is connected to each of these grayscales. Then you've got the normal, which is a color map, and the base color, which is also a color map. So very, very efficient way of packing textures themselves. I'm going to close this guy, and we will go ahead and take a look at the actual import settings here, because we do need to import, right? So first of all, we're going to import some of our meshes that we kind of forgot over these video courses. And actually, let's first import the substance, seeing that I'm already there. Now, importing the substance actually is probably better if we did this in a new folder, since it's going to create a bunch of new files. So I'm going to call this substance, and I'm going to say import to this folder the substance file here. Now, clearly, of course, I could have simply specified a default instance path for my instances. In other words, I could have my substance files in a separate folder and have my instances, for example, my content folder, where I can actually change them. But like I said, I'm not really going to bother for that right now, since there's no point really. What this is, if you take a look, you've got a sand material. Double click this. These are all of our materials. Notice that they're not packed together. The roughness, the metallic, the normal, and the base color are kind of on the same spot. And this is our material. Now, it doesn't look like a lot, but it should look much better once we assign it to a to an object, which would be presumably our terrain, which we haven't imported yet. The point is that if you double click on your sand instance, you're going to get all the parameters that we've exposed in the host application, which would be the designer. As you can see, we've got our blenders. Obviously, they're in a slider form, not a drop-down form. You've got your wave count, apex position, etc., etc. So all of these groups that we've grouped in Designer are also available here. You can also obviously enable runtime modifications. In other words, well, technically they're enabled by default, but you should probably disable them in our case, since we're not going to be changing anything at runtime. Although just for demonstrative purposes, we might as well. I'm not sure what we're going to do. Obviously, you can select the outputs here. We can also add the height as an output. This will automatically add a height here. Obviously, assuming we save our work, which is what we have to do anyway. Right. That being said, I'm not going to just linger too much on the substances here. You can play around with them yourself. What we need to do now is import some terrain. In other words, our actual geometry, which we'll be using for the game, which I believe are in our actual project file, right? Import folder, So there we are. We got the net and the terrain. Now I'm not sure if I triangulated these, but it doesn't really matter. The engine will triangulate them themselves. And there is no smoothing groups to be worried about, since everything is a hard edge either way. So that's not a big deal. Even if I didn't triangulate them, I believe they'll be just fine. I'm going to import them here. I don't need any collision on them. I'm going to make my own. Although you can definitely create some collision here automatically. It depends on what you're trying to do, right? Probably we will have automatic collision on our mesh. Sorry, not the mesh, but the the net. But for the terrain, there really is no need. A simple box will do. Anyway, we're going to talk about this in the next few videos, but for now, just simply import this. Obviously, you can define your own material, but since they share, by the way, a name material, so both of them using Fong1, if you import all of them, they will also share Fong1 right here. Obviously, this is a simply useless material. It's got a white color, which is the default color of your... no, I don't want to save anything. I'm just going to close this guy and delete it anyway. As you can see, force delete. I don't want it because I'll be applying the substance to the terrain, and the net itself, I kind of want to show it. I have shitty UVs on it. You should remember that. I made pretty bad UVs. You can actually even take a look at them. So if we take a look here, they're all overlapping. This is the entire UV section for my net, and I kind of wanted to show you how this could be a problem. So I don't know if I'm going to do that in the future or not, but generally speaking, these are not the UVs that you want for something like this. Although technically you could make it work. It depends on how you want to approach this. But the important thing is that I will probably simply leave this I'll probably simply leave this as it is and simply make it white, especially due to the fact that the player will be seeing it in this kind of fashion. It's going to be something like this. Oops. There we go. Something like this. So there really is no need. White will do just fine. To be fair, you don't even need these squares here. The reason I had them is because I kind of thought maybe if we decide to use the camera in something fancy, we might actually need this to be representing a net. But other than that, stretched cube will do just fine. One more thing, like I said in another video, you could simply use a transparency map and make these squares being transparent. So it will be, instead of having that many triangles, as you can see, we got loads of triangles here, right? Instead of having that, you could simply have one stretch cube, and this would allow you to, create the illusion that it's a net, but in reality it isn't. So there's that as well. Definitely loads of options when it comes to your to the way you approach your asset creation and the way you import stuff, and obviously with different impacts on your overall performance for the game. So I'm going to close this as well. There's no need for that. And finally, really, I think that's really as much as I'm willing to delve into in this case, into Unreal, since this is fairly wrapped up, right? There's nothing left to talk about. We've got our Flintstone space, which is essentially with all the stuff that we need. As you can see, we've got our SP textures here, which has been created by by simply importing things to Painter. Painter created these textures. Let's double check if this thing is working correctly. Let's grab something like, I don't know, a green color and simply run through. That's actually a pretty cool color. And as you can see, we've got our exports. Take a look here. Double click on our worm. It should have this green stripe here. I really need to modify my speed settings here for the camera. But as you can see, it's working quite correctly, with the exception of this thing actually taking up for some reason the foreground. But as of now, we are officially in the game. In other words, we can work, right? We're in the workflow, and we've got a pipeline set up. Now, from now on, in the next video, we'll be talking about programming concepts, etc. So we'll be diving into Unreal. This is the beginning of sort of the Unreal section of the video, of the series. Now, what do you need at this point? By now, you need to have a proper understanding of how the UI operates. In other words, you have to know how to navigate your scene, what kind of tools you got available here on the side, what do all these buttons do, the terrain, etc. Obviously, just essentially you have to have played around with the engine a little bit. Obviously, we won't be diving into terraining or brushing like paint, for example, or even adding details to our terrain. We only use the geometry editing, which is our brush sort of tools, allowing us to block out a level. Now, in your case, you should have a level blocked out by now. And you also should be fairly comfortable with navigating the scene. Okay, so you could select something, navigate it in Maya style. In a Maya style navigation. For crying out loud. Obviously, don't click on here because it will draw. Holding Alt will draw a duplicate. But a Maya style navigation is just fine. Obviously, you can use the gaming navigation, which is WASD, by holding the right mouse button. Q goes down, E goes up, right? Fairly simple. So you should have a good understanding of how this whole thing operates, what these, this is like a skylight, etc., etc. These are player spawns. Like I said, not too in-depth, but at least a general understanding of what everything does so that we can navigate Unreal Engine properly. Then you also need to understand how basic textures work, channels, different output maps, what they're used for, and such and such. So it doesn't have to be a designer, but as long as you understand what output channels do and what kind of maps we've got and what they're used for, you'll be golden. Generally speaking, though, it would be best if you do have sort of an understanding of designer, if you know how to work with Painter, and of course, generally speaking, Maya or any other programming, modeling application. By that I mean not only Maya to make 3D meshes, but also animate, rig them, and perhaps even create some control rigs if you need some for whatever it is you're doing. Now, we don't need to have any understanding of sound. Well, you do, but like I don't have any understanding of sound. I'm not a sound engineer. I'm not really interested in that area. So generally speaking, when it comes to sound, I simply either buy it or get it for free. Some free commons license or whatever that allows me to use the particular sound. Either that, of course, or desperate times I could probably make a loop. Like I've only done a loop on Audacity. So whatever your audio engineering background is, be it if you have none, in other words, it being non-existent, or you're like sort of well versed into in the area, yeah, it's a bonus to have, but it's not a necessity. However, what is necessary is an ability to create 3D assets. These 3D assets must be, in some cases, animated. So there is you must have an ability to create rigs. Then these rigs have to have a control rig for you to animate properly, meaning that you need to have the knowledge of creating the control rig and having proper joint orientations, etc. As well as you need to know how to animate the damn thing, and then have the keys set up, and then you have to actually export it. At the same time, you have to know how to paint this stuff, how to create for example, the substance in this case. Essentially, how to manage your 2D textures. Okay, whenever you create a 3D model, it's not textured, so you need to know how to use the bakers, how to create these different maps, how to have many different outputs, what these outputs are used for, and then of course you need to know how to import them to Unreal, which we've done a couple of times by now. You should know. Lastly, of course, you need to have everything versioned. You might say by now, hopefully you would know why you need to have it versioned, but if you think that you can get it done without versioning it, more power to you, but it is a backup worth having, mainly because well, look, get burned once and then you'll learn, if that's the case, if you're still not running a version control system. Not to mention that if you're trying to cooperate with someone like a team or with a friend of yours overseas or another side of the world, yeah, version control is pretty much the only way to go at that point. Don't use Dropbox. I highly recommend not to use Dropbox or any of the cloud service that gives you like this backup system. Definitely not. It's a mistake not worth making. It could bite you in the ass way down the production line. All right. So that being said, this is the end of the pipeline videos. Everything up to this point is a build-up to Unreal Engine 4. Just for the future, so that you know, Unreal Engine 4 is a vastly, immensely complicated piece of software, okay? There's so much in this software. I'm not sure there is one person on this planet that knows everything there is to know about Unreal, since it's just so huge. Now, on the outside, on the surface, it might look like very little, but in reality, as you start diving in, look, just think about this. Every single one of these things has its own editor, Okay, that's like having another designer, for example, right? Every single one of these things, well, most of them have their own editors, right? And that's just the editors, the amount of settings, different plugins, all that jazz. That's not even talking about diving into the actual source code for the engine, all right? You've got loads of different things: artificial intelligence, behavior trees. You've got your where's my a whole animation setup, which actually more resembles more programming than animating. Then you've got a whole blueprint section, which is all your logic. Then you've got your blendables, which essentially is your all of your morph targets. Sorry, not morph targets, but all these material instances, etc. But then they're also available in your animation setup here. You've got media. You can embed different videos or even record videos. Look, Unreal Engine is used for it can be used for from game production to architectural visualization and all the way up to movies. All right, so very versatile program. You know, obviously there's a HUD as well here. There's a whole editor for that. You've got there's a whole sound engine that I have no idea how it works yet because it's been introduced at like 4.17, I think, or something. But the point is that it's very powerful. Just by looking at the live presentation at GDC, I was very impressed. Learning it, however, is just a daunting task for, like, you have to specialize in this most likely. But I guess you could use it for something, especially if you play around with it. You got a whole physics engine here. Paper 2D is for 2D games, but honestly, I don't bother with that. And I think it's been abandoned by the Epic team, since there's really barely any updates for the thing. It's like, kind of like a bonus token mode, in other words. All right. Obviously, you've got a bunch of other things. I really don't know half of these things what are for. Well, there's force feedback. So if you have a controller, that's how you run this. Got a camera animations for video tutorials. Then you got tutorials for the blueprint. Video tutorials for your videos, cinematic, in-game cinematics, etc. So look, there's a lot of stuff. All right, there's a lot. Whole particle system that actually, like, it's probably the best particle system I've ever seen in my life, but it's so freaking complex. You can make quite a lot of things here with those tools that are available at your fingertips. So all in all, if I had to say, if you take Maya, Painter, and Designer, and you combine their complexity and difficulty in terms of learning the whole thing, and you multiply it by 2, probably you will have the learning curve for Unreal Engine 4. Now, the learning curve is not steep. That's the cool thing. However, the ceiling is immeasurably high. Okay, so if the learning curve is something like this, where it would go very slowly, you can get into it very easily, right? Getting into Unreal is very easy, but mastering the thing is immensely difficult. You'd have to go above the actual screen here to get something. So I'm just saying, in this video series, we will not be going over every single thing. I will only show you the basics, the most basic way of using the engine, right? How to get a basic game going and how to get the basic thing running, right? You'll know what to search for if you get stuck, if you're in trouble, you know what to search for, and how to approach a particular problem. But you won't know everything. I think it's actually impossible. And even if it was possible, probably is possible, the point is just a huge waste of time. That you don't need to know everything. All right, that's the reason the engine exists. Unfortunately, due to its size, also the documentation is probably the poorest out of the 3 pieces I used before as an example. Designer and Painter have an absolutely marvelous. I mean, it's a beauty to look at in terms of documentation. Video documentations, animated GIF images showing you how things work. You've got example images for different substances. It's ridiculously good, very detailed, very high quality. Obviously, there's a few typos here and there, but who gives a shit? However, Maya is probably the second on the chopping block. It's not as good, but it's got loads of information on its own. Not as well documented, not as well written as Algorithmics. However, it's still usable. Unreal, on the other hand, well, it's a clusterfuck, to be honest. I mean, they've got some really great bits where there's a lot of information. Like in general, the editors themselves have really good documentation. And then they got really shitty bits. Like, for example, if you find a blueprint that you don't know what it does, and you just, look up the documentation, what the blueprint does, and simply the explanation of what it does is the name of the blueprint, right? I mean, it might be very self-explanatory, but there are cases where you won't find a single example of how this is used, what this does, and whatnot. So you might have to go through Unreal Answers, the Answer Hub in Unreal Engine, which essentially is like a Stack Exchange or Stack Overflow, depending whichever you use. The point is that, yeah, once you start using Unreal, you pretty much never really stop learning. And that's obviously true for Maya, Designer, and Painter, but it's even more true for Unreal Engine 4. All right. Now that being said, we are finished. What I'm gonna do next is simply finish this painting, get this thing presentable, and then obviously I'm gonna bake these maps here, paint a couple of details here and there, add it here, and then I will simply save, and that'll be the end of that. And after that, we'll actually start talking about the the programming aspects of it. By the way, make sure that you add your SP textures. This folder will be created and generated for every time the first time you actually send something to Painter, it will create this folder, and then for every single asset, it's going to have its own folder, I think. So make sure to mark these things for addition, because you do want them to be in your version control system. You want them versioned fairly properly as well. So make sure they're in. Okay. Obviously, you might have to check them out manually. I'm not sure if Unreal will present you with the option of checking them out whenever you send something to Painter, but it should. It definitely should. So mark these for add, and you could also do the same, obviously, from Unreal. So you can mark all of these for adding. In fact, you should probably do just that. Source control, mark for add. There we go. They're all marked for add. In fact, I should probably revert this here, this manual edition. Where's my reversion? Revert files. Yes. Revert that. As you can see, they're all available over here. Then we've got our actual materials. We've got our normals, etc. These are all binary files. Whatever, just leave them here, because I'm not sure now. I can't. I'm not very sure here about the addition here. You know what? Let's leave it off for now. But again, it's entirely your prerogative. Right? I'm pretty sure if I add these, I'm gonna have to check them out every time I send something to Unreal, which is kind of a pain in the ass. So plus these are target files, which are not really used. For some reason, these are also binaries. Oh yeah, well, they are binaries actually, not images. What the hell am I talking about? Okay, that being said, guys, this is the end of this video and the end of the whole pipeline series and really everything before Unreal. This is the cutoff point. By now, you should know everything at this, behind that. At least have a good understanding. And after this is all Unreal. No more Designer, no more Maya, no more Painter. From now on, we start actual game development. And with that, obviously, we finish this video. In the next video, we'll be talking about the programming, object-oriented programming, how it works, what's the idea, in the abstract fashion, of course. Okay, I'll see you guys later. Bye-bye.